Hey Neil, how are you?
Good, Dan. How are you this morning?
Doing well, really enjoying the day. Looking forward to talking to you. You have an interesting background, someone that I've never talked to before with this background. So I'm really interested to hear about your insights and learn more about what you've experienced as an author in various mediums of art. So yeah, we'll get into that in just a second. But how long have you been writing and publishing?
Oh my gosh, that's a good question. I mean, I've been writing for as long as I can remember, ever since I was a little kid. In terms of publishing, well, I've published my book 2018, I want to say. Um, and then it came out as an audiobook in 2020. Um, I've had some short stories published before that, but I don't know if you can count that.
I mean, a lot of people give varying levels of weight to their writing experience. I mean, writing is writing to me. So I think
Yes.
short stories have this just a very specific type of skills to write them. Some people know how, and some people not so much. But yeah, writing is writing. So have you published in anthologies then as well as a part of those short stories, or most of them kind of individually published stories?
Yes, they've been part of anthologies. My very first one actually was when I was just a kid. It was for the '88 Winter Olympics. That was my
Okay.
first published anthology piece. Yeah, it turned out they were doing calls because I grew up in Calgary, Alberta, which is where the Olympics took place, and the government, I guess, I don't even know who really was behind it. The Olympic Committee, maybe they put out a call for short stories from kids, and
Hmm.
so I found myself being published, and it was kind of this whirlwind thing where I found myself suddenly being interviewed on TV and in the paper, and on CBC, which is kind of our government um, sort of state media, I guess you could call it. So it was kind of this national attention all of a sudden for just a fun story that I wrote in the middle of class. And that was what kind of really kicked off my love for wanting to pursue this and keep going with it.
That's really cool. I mean, it's one of those stories that just seems so off the wall for many of us. But as a kid, that probably what meant so much to you. Memories from that, I can imagine, are just like ingrained in your mind. But how encouraging for you as well to get into that. So, where do screenplays fit into your writing and your journey as an author?
Yeah, so I took a little bit of a departure from writing in general for about, let's say, 20 years, because I went into a technical field. I became an electrical engineer,
Okay.
and that was the career that I pursued. But I always did writing on the side as a hobby, just something to sort of, occupy that more creative space within my mind. But I didn't get into screenwriting until, I guess it would have been about 2006, 2007 when I took my first acting class. It was something that I did because I moved to Edmonton, Alberta. I didn't know anybody. I moved for work and I wanted to try something had never tried before. And so I took an acting class just as a way to expand my horizons and also to meet other people and
Hmm.
things like this. And I had such a great time doing it and met all these wonderful people. And through the process, I started writing short screenplays. And it was really more for, this group of actors and whatnot that I had gotten to know that we could sort of do fun new things together. And then that progressed to me saying to myself, well, I wonder if I could tackle a feature screenplay. And so then I did that. And but unfortunately, not really having a wide audience of film industry people, I really didn't know if it was any good between you and me. Having your friends tell you something is good and having your mom tell you something is good is very
Hmm.
different from getting actual feedback. And
Yep.
so I decided to enter it into just film festivals and screenwriting contests and things like this because I found out that those things exist. And sure enough, my screenplay started winning awards. And so then I wrote more, won more awards. And then that got me the attention of some local filmmakers who then brought me onto their projects to help rewrite their scripts that they were filming. Um, and this process just sort of kind of snowballed. And here I am, I don't know, around 15 to 20 screenplays later. A number of them have been produced now. I've just finished the uh, what can we call it? The post production on my directorial debut feature film, which I also wrote. And that's going to be hitting the film festival circuit now. So it's been kind of a really wild ride and a lot of fun.
That's really interesting. I've never heard someone describe kind of their journey through screenplays. I have no experience even reading screenplays. Like I don't even know what the format of those is. We don't have to get into that. I'm sure there's complicated rules and stylized guides and whatnot for that. But when it comes to writing these screenplays and the novels, you've written one novel so far, right? At this point, or
I've actually
published
written
one.
published one, but I've written three. So
Awesome.
yes.
So, in terms of the difference between writing those two, is it significantly different, the mindset you have to have as you're writing these different pieces of art?
It's actually not as different as you might think. Really,
Cool.
what it comes down to is the difference in format between the two. So the way I like to describe it to people is that screenplays are written specifically for two senses only, what you can see and what you can hear. So imagine
Okay.
you are writing for the screen, right? Anything else beyond that doesn't really belong in a screenplay. Whereas a novel, as you know, that's all the other senses, including what you think, what you feel, what you can remember, what you dream about, all of these things wrapped up, right? Because you are inside a person's head in a novel, whereas on the screen, everything is external. And you have to be able to convey even internal dialogue or internal emotions through that external format. So we have to be able to see it and hear it in order for it to be there.
That makes sense. It's one of those things you just don't think about. I mean,
Yeah.
when you explain it, it's like, oh yeah, that totally makes sense. When you imagine from a screenplay perspective, the audience what they're experiencing versus a novel. But it's really interesting. I think it can be said for a lot of different types. Short stories even maybe have it's just a different style, but at the same time, it's just compacting your knowledge of writing in general to put it in a smaller piece of art. So I think there's a lot of people that maybe hear the different modes of writing and think, oh, they're vastly different. I mean, I admittedly was under the impression screenplay writing was quite different, but hearing that, you think, oh yeah, that's very logical to look at it
Mhm.
that way. But whatever form of writing you're working on, whether it be short stories, long stories, screenplays, and whatnot, the crux of it is learning and over your journey of writing, being able to improve upon bettering that work. And that's something that you've indicated you're excited about, you're passionate about. You've worked with other authors or artists, I guess you could call them, helping you with your screenplays. Maybe you've co-written some of these things. So for you, what's the process behind bettering your work? You've written tons of screenplays now. Comparing your experience with the first one to the most recent one you've written, how have you worked on bettering that experience?
Well, I think everything stems from this idea that a film is a very collaborative process versus authorship, which I find to be
Sure.
a very solitary one, right? The entire process, pretty much from start to finish, other than the input of maybe a few key people, such as your editor or your beta readers, really is a very solitary thing. Film is pretty much the opposite of that. Almost through the entire process, you're getting input from other people. So, for example, if you're working on a screenplay with a specific director or producer, you're getting constant feedback on the things that you are writing. And different people in the process are looking at this work from a different lens. So
Mm,
while I'm looking at it purely from a storytelling perspective, right, trying to craft the best story that I can, a director might be looking at it from a more visual standpoint, saying, what do I want to see on the screen? What are the messages that I want to convey with this work creatively? While a producer might look at it to say, oh gosh, how much will this piece cost? Or how much will this action scene cost? Or how much will this giant set piece cost? And they tend to look at it much more from a financial standpoint. And that can also affect the story from that level. And so just getting used to that collaborative process. And then, of course, once you're filming, you have the actor's input, which is critical, right? Because they will have their take on the words that have been put to the page, and the way that they say the dialogue. Do you need to stick with the words exactly as written? What do you mean by this? Where is my character's headspace at this moment? Things like this of this nature. And so once you sort of get used to that whole idea of it takes a village to create a film, I felt like I could apply that mentality to story writing in general. And so, yeah, from the beginning, I've kind of had people coming to me asking me, what do you think of this? What do you think of this work? Whether it's a short story, whether it's a screenplay. And I found right from day one, honesty was the best policy, you know,
Hmm.
s- but in a way that's constructive. I believe in constructive criticism. And I think this is kind of where my philosophy of bettering yourself and your work comes through. It's very easy to just tear down somebody's work and say, oh, that's no good. But without giving reasons why, without diving into what is it specifically that doesn't work and why doesn't it work? And let's analyze this. Um, and I think through that conversation, you can really find some good answers and craft a better story because of it. Sometimes things are only, maybe structurally there's a problem. Things like you're not really following the three-act structure very solidly, or you're veering off into these weird subplots that don't go anywhere. But other times, it's really down to the story itself, the sort of meat and potatoes, right? What's at the heart of this story? What is the theme? What are we trying to say? Is there any subtext? Is everything just sort of on the surface level and on the nose? And so these are the types of things I love to dive in with people and in my own work.
Could you find yourself being this person, screenplays or novels or whatnot? Are you that feedback person? Do you have a group or something that you meet with, or maybe close friends, close author friends that you found yourself this criticized partner? I don't know if there's a word for it. Critique partner, maybe is the best term for it. Are you that person then helping
I
other
tend to
people?
Yeah, I tend to be that person for other people. When I first started out, I was part of a little writers group, we called ourselves, and I have lots of friends who have the same sort of thing, live in different parts of North America, and they have little circles like that too. And everybody seems to find it very beneficial
Hmm.
because as long as egos are checked at the door, I find is the number one thing. You can't take criticism personally. When somebody
Hmm.
tells you something doesn't work for them, you have to respect that and say, okay, on an emotional level, they're telling me that they're not resonating with my work. Rather than being hurt or insulted by this, I should take it to heart and say, okay, let's have a conversation. What is it that doesn't work about it? And is there any way that I can improve it that maybe it will?
Well, and I think so. You've highlighted a lot of things here, and I think that there's it's a very solitary job being an author. The way you described it is part of the reason I started this podcast in the first place. It's so ironic how writing works, in novels, short stories for people can feel so isolating when there's so many other authors experiencing the same thing and wondering, am I the only one doing this? Right. But that feedback, whatever that feedback cycle looks like, is crucial. Whether, that process looks different for everybody. You've got ARC readers, beta readers, alpha readers, there's all sorts of opportunities to get this feedback. But I think the one thing that you talked about that maybe people don't realize is you got to find the right people. And even if you don't necessarily have the right people, you need to guide them to give you the feedback that you need. I think there's a lot of things that people don't realize. If you give this to a family member or a close friend or whatnot, more often than not, like you said, they're going to say, oh, that's great,
Yeah.
it was awesome. Well, that's not helpful, right? So you maybe hear some of the things that I'm, problem areas I'm worried about, or were there any parts where you were bored, very specific questions to draw feedback from them. That's going to get you more helpful feedback. If your only support system is those close friends currently, maybe you're a new author, at least guide them, get as much feedback as possible until you can build up your network, until you can find writing groups or a critique partner that writes in a genre that is similar to yours. You can kind of help each other. So I think this is one of those things is when we're writing, we have this sense that, oh, the story is really great, or maybe we think it's terrible. It probably depends like the moment of the book you're writing. But that critique, that feedback is so important. So for the screenplays, does
Yeah.
everybody just know their set roles, or were there some like mutual understanding that you had to come to for each person to know, hey, this is how you need to look at this screenplay to provide your feedback and edits?
I think it depends. It depends on who you're speaking with. One of the bits of advice I would give to somebody who's sort of starting in this process of expanding their circle and looking at people to read their work would be to say, look for people who enjoy this specific genre of
Mm,
work,
mhm.
right? Because if all you love is rom-coms and yet somebody's giving you a horror, you're probably not going to gravitate to that work regardless. It could be the best horror book ever written, but if you only love rom-coms, you're just going to look at that and go, yeah, that's not really for me, right? So what valuable input can you really give? And I think that's an important distinction, and that was one that we sort of figured out in our little group early on when we were presenting our work. We would do it kind of in two levels. One would be just from a technical standpoint of
Mm.
how does the writing stack up, in terms of, is the message getting across? Uh, are you saying what you want to say through these characters? Is there anything that's on the nose? Is there any subtext? Um, are the scenes exciting? Is there a good pace to everything? Is it being driven along? So these are all technical details, right? Then there was the other side where if some of us in the group, for example, were action fans and somebody had written an action scene or an action script, then we could analyze it from that standpoint as fans and say, you know what, if I was in a theater, would I love what I'm watching? Or would this kind of bore me? Or does it need some tweaking? Or, how can we fix it? So I think it's a two-level process.
Definitely is. And I mean, the way my brain works, my ADHD thoughts is it's more than two steps. There's like tons of steps to this process, right? But I think recognizing, so a number of things, right? Recognizing everybody's place in the feedback cycle, whether it be with a screenplay or with your novel, and then, accepting that feedback with taking it with a grain of salt, perhaps, is the best way to look at it. Because the thing that you need to recognize, particularly when you're working with other people, is their feelings, their thoughts are real and they're meaningful, but they don't necessarily speak for the general populace. So getting that feedback should help you kind of take a pathway of thoughts of, oh, I didn't recognize that this might elicit certain experiences or feelings in someone because I haven't had that experience. Now that I know it can, let's look at it with a different perspective. And just, I think a lot of people get feedback and they're like, oh, I have to change everything. It's like, no, that's not what it means. You already said it, right? Can I change the existing script or manuscript to make it work, to solve the problems? And for example, my wife, she does not read fantasy. She doesn't like fantasy, but I write fantasy. So she, out of
Right.
the goodness of her heart, she still reads my books. And every bit of feedback she gives me, she's like, but look, I don't like fantasy normally. So do with it what you will. So it doesn't offend me when she says things like, all right,
Mhm.
like the names. She has a huge problem with the names and how strange fantasy names are. I'm like, well, that's just fantasy for you, right? I'm not gonna go change names. But it's one of those things where you have to know that, right? You have to have this mutual understanding. We both know that she doesn't read fantasy. And so the feedback she gives me is for specific purpose. Someone who doesn't read the genre, maybe use them for general feedback, maybe pacing, whatnot. Someone who does read fantasy, get into the little bit more nitty gritty stuff. So you just have to recognize, hey, this person or these people that I'm working with, where does their feedback fit in for me? And I think if you don't have those people, that's when now is the time to try to find those people, find the people that can help you with your books in whatever way you need it. So you
Yeah,
write horror. I forgot to mention that.
yes.
So just so people listening, that's why horror came into play. We'll get into that in a little bit later, but you were about to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to add on to that. I get the exact same thing with my wife. She doesn't like horror at all,
Mm,
and that's one of my biggest genres that I like to delve into. And but I've also found you know that type of feedback can be very valuable as well,
yeah.
because if somebody who's not a fan of the specific genre tells you, "Wow, this moved me," you
Hmm.
know, on an emotional level. Maybe I don't like this, the types of stories you're telling, but I'm finding a connection with your characters and with what they're going through. That can be very positive feedback as well, because then that tells you that your work might just find a wider audience than you originally intended.
Yep, absolutely. And it does provide a little bit of validation for spanning beyond audience, right? Because my
Mhm.
my wife indicated that she doesn't read fantasy, but she found herself really excited about the characters. Like I was actually surprised that I enjoyed it as much as I did. And she's a blunt person, so I know she's not lying when she says this. Of course, she tells me the part she hated, which is great. But it provides an interesting insight to, okay, well, maybe the target audience for my story, I am hitting that, but I'm finding, I kind of pulled in this other type of audience that maybe I didn't expect to hit, because these other people who don't normally read it found enjoyment in it. So yeah, the feedback is very valuable. I think don't deny anybody the opportunity to read your book if they're express interest, even if it's maybe not their thing. But like I said, have that conversation beforehand, understand where they're coming from and what their experience is, so that you're not offended by the feedback that comes through. Because it's going to be interesting, especially if they don't normally read that.
One other bit of advice, that I can impart through my process that I found was, everybody has their own opinions on something. And when somebody reads your work, maybe they've had a bad day. Maybe they're going through something personally. So whatever feedback they're giving you might be just related more on them rather than the work itself. And it's really just sort of the lens that they're viewing your work through. So the lesson that I learned early on was, if two or more people point out the same problematic area, that's something worth paying attention to, especially if they've never talked with each other, but they're both seeing something. Then that's something as an author or writer you might want to pay attention to and potentially address. So
that's a really interesting thought. Probably something that people might not think about. As authors, I think we can sometimes feel really in love with the things that we've written. Sometimes it's hard to change those. But yeah, like you said, if you're getting multiple points of feedback that something might be slightly off, that should be a pretty big indicator that, hey, maybe we should look at this again, be a little bit more critical with this piece of writing. So this is a really hard question probably to answer, but how do you deal with the overwhelm of receiving that feedback and applying that feedback? You've done it however many times over with screenplays. So you get to a point where you get into the groove of taking this feedback and doing something with it. But how do you handle the overwhelm of the feedback?
I think there's a couple of different layers to that answer for myself personally. One would be, what type of feedback is it? So in other words, is this just a friend or a colleague I've asked to look this over on a casual basis? Or is this part of the job that I'm working? So for example, if it's a script and I'm handing it to a director or producer who then gives me feedback, that's feedback that I really have to take seriously. And sometimes I don't really have an option to change things. Sometimes it literally becomes like, you know what, we can't afford this, so you have to change it. Okay, then I will go and change it, right? As opposed to somebody saying, oh, you know what, I'm not sure about this. And, then it's really up to you to make that decision. Does this stay? Does this go? As the author of a work, all the power really rests in your hands. As a screenwriter, you find that it's sort of diminishing power the longer it goes down that line. I've always liked to think of it as, as a screenwriter, you're kind of a guy who builds a car in his garage, but then there comes a point where you're selling that car and you sell it to somebody who happens to be the studio or the producer or whoever. And as soon as you turn over that pink slip and those keys, it doesn't really belong to you anymore. And from that moment on, if they keep you on as the writer, it is to do whatever they want to do. It's like they're hiring you now to be a mechanic on their car, right? So if they want to put, chrome rims and a giant spoiler on this car that you think none of those things belong on it, then it really comes down to it becomes a question of what's more important to you at that point. If you're really passionate about the work, and you feel like your integrity is being challenged with the changes that are being asked of you, then you really have to say, am I the right person to keep working on this? Versus if the script was just a paycheck to begin with, and you're not married to that work on an emotional level, it's like, well, I did my best. I provided as good a script as I could. But really, I'm just giving this because I know it will go into somebody else's hands and changes will be made because that's a normal part of the process. If that's your attitude, then yeah, you can stick with it and change whatever changes they want to make, which is not to say that there's never any pushback on a writer's part. I just think in the screenwriting world, you have to know when to pick your battles
Mm,
to say, whether you feel really like, no, you guys are missing the point. This character arc has to have these specific beats because this is where I'm trying to get to. And sometimes those are really necessary conversations to have to explain to the person on the other end who maybe just didn't notice that or didn't see it. But other times, it's like they just tell you, listen, just from a logistic standpoint, we can't have this, so we needed to change to something else. Okay.
I mean, that's a really important piece of advice. I think a lot of people don't put a lot of weight into that, right? Even with a novel, right? It's different because you're not technically handing, I guess it depends, right? With traditionally published books, technically they are purchasing it, and that dynamic might be a little bit different than self-publishing, but I think the rule still apply, or the principle still applies. You've got different types of feedback that you're receiving from different types of people. And so
Mhm.
looking at those pieces of feedback with the proper mindset, I think can help with the overwhelm. And I think, I've never thought about it that way, right? Your editor's pieces of feedback, such as misspellings or grammatical errors, those are non-negotiable, right? That would be the
Right.
equivalent of the screenwriter or the production people saying, no, we can't afford that, right? You just got to change it. There's no question about it.
That's
But
right.
then there's other pieces of feedback, which is like, oh, I felt X way during this, or I got this impression from this scene. Okay, well, let's think about it. That doesn't necessarily mean it has to change. Talk to the person and find out, well, what other pieces of the story might have led you to that. And then you
Mhm.
find out, oh, I had a bad day, right? Or
Right.
I'm going through X. And you're like, oh, well, that's helpful information to know. Does that mean I changed my manuscript? Maybe, maybe not. But at least now I know that information. I think people get feedback and they just see a lot of red, red
Yes.
pen, and they're just like, I'm stressed. But just remember, who's it coming from? What type of feedback is it? And then once you sift that through, I can totally see how that helps with the overwhelm. Just knowing what to click yes to and what to say, I'll set this aside for later and I can solve that. When you look at everything equally, it just feels huge. It's like this
Mhm.
big undertaking. So for you, how do you ensure that the lessons you've learned as you've gone through your various screenplays and your novels and versions and whatnot, that you remember the things that you've learned to apply to your next books? Do you just keep everything mentally? Do you have a spot where you've made note of, hey, this is a common problem of mine, remember not to do this in the next versions of whatever I'm writing? How do you keep moving forward and not make the same mistakes you have in the past?
Yeah, I think you know what? It's an evolutionary process. I think as
Mm,
a writer, as a creator, as an artist, you have to have that mentality that you're always learning, that nobody's perfect, right? There
mm,
was only one Mozart, I like to say. The only
yeah.
one person who ever got it right off the bat. I can't think of any other artist in history that's been able to do that. So, you know, and I would never say that, oh yeah, this work is perfect right out of the gate. That would be crazy thing to say. Um, so for me, yes, I think it's important to keep note of some of those lessons learned. And sometimes it's little things, sometimes it's things like just learning proper structure
Mm,
of storytelling, right? Sort of keying in mind when you start a project, what is the structure you're trying to tell? Is it a 3-act story? Is it a 4-act story? Are you doing like Rashomon structure? Are you doing, there's so many different types of stories that you can tell. But each one has its own set of guidelines, right? I won't say rules because let's be honest, there are no set rules in our world. This is all just kind of like guidelines based on what has worked historically in the past,
mm,
right? The 3-act structure, for example, that's the most classic form of storytelling because that's the one I think deep down inside we are all familiar with. The earliest man, when he came home from his saber-toothed tiger hunt into his cave, what did he do? He told a beginning, middle, and an end of a story, and that's all
mm.
3-act structure is, right? And so it's in us, it's ingrained in us, and I think that's why people respond to it so well. But even that has its own guidelines to follow of where the story beats need to take us, what are the highs, where are the lows. Um, so those are the things that I've learned along the way. But then over time, I've taken it past that to learn more about character arcs. What do my characters need to go through? what type of story am I trying to tell through them? Am I talking about a character that actually undergoes some kind of a change, or is it a character that changes others? Is it a character that undergoes positive change? Is it a character that undergoes negative change? And then how to best put that on paper, so transfer that over to the reader so that the reader understands the journey I'm trying to take them on through this story. And I just find that that's a evolving process for me. I don't have all the answers yet. I don't think I ever will. I like to think of it I once had Chuck Palahniuk, writer of Fight Club, inscribe my copy of Fight Club for me, and he wrote in
Wow.
it the most wonderful message I could have ever gotten, which was, he said, "Neil, may you never be perfect." And I loved that, because to me that says, yes, I will never be stagnant, and I will always be reaching for that peak, and hoping to get there. And I hope to spend the rest of my life doing exactly that.
I mean, looking at the process that way is the right mindset because you will never be perfect, but the learning process can be enjoyable. Painful
Exactly.
sometimes, but in the
Yeah.
end, it's something that you can learn to enjoy.
Yes.
And enjoy the journey, right? Don't just
Yes.
focus on the ending. I think there's a lot of thought to be said about that. Well, this has been excellent. There's probably so much more we could discuss. We are running short on time. Before we end here, I always love to ask, where can people find more information about you, your books, possibly your screenplays, your movies?
Yeah, the two best places, one is my website, neilchasefilm.com, where you can find more about my books, my services as a mentor, as a cover providing coverage for screenplays, for short stories, novels. But also, you can find me on brimstonepictures.com, where you'll find information about the film projects that I am doing, including my upcoming film, Spin the Wheel, which is an apocalyptic thriller.
Awesome. That's really cool. I'll have to look at that. I've been to
Please.
your website, but I haven't looked at the Brimstone website. So take a look at those if you're interested. But yeah, thanks so much for your time. This has been excellent.
Thank you so much, Dan. It was a real pleasure.